the year 1328. The February sky over Paris hangs like a leaden, joyless shroud. Within the walls of the Château de Vincennes, that stern stone guardian sprawling east of the capital, the air is thick and still. It is saturated with the scents of incense, wax, and an inevitable cold sorrow. In the royal chambers, steeped in a gloom that even the flames of dozens of candles cannot disperse, lies Charles IV on his deathbed, King of France and Navarre, nicknamed the Fair. But now in his gaunt, parchment-like face, not a trace of his former attractiveness remains. His breath is intermittent and shallow, and his eyes, once clear, are clouded with the misty veil of impending oblivion. He is the last son of the mighty and terrible King Philip IV the Fair, the very Iron King who crushed the Knights Templar and made the papal throne tremble. The curse cast from the pyre by the last Grand Master of the Order seemed to have caught up with his entire line. Pope Clement, King Philip, Guillaume de Nogaret, within a year I shall summon you to God's judgment. These words, uttered in the flames, had echoed through the history of France for 14 years. And the curse came true with horrifying precision. The Pope, the advisor, and the king himself died within the appointed time. And then, one after another, all three of Philip's sons departed. Louis X, the quarrelsome, who reigned for only 2 years. Philip V, the tall, whose reign was not much longer. And now, Charles. None of them left a male heir. The great Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 3 centuries uninterruptedly from father to son, was fading before the eyes of the shocked barons gathered at the deathbed. Around the bed stood the most powerful men of the kingdom. Among them, the figure of Philip, Count of Valois, the king's cousin, stands out. His face is an impenetrable mask, but in the depths of his eyes burns the fire of impatient anticipation. He is the closest male relative, and according to ancient Salic law, which precisely now, in this crisis situation, acquires a new decisive force, it is he who should become regent and possibly king. Beside him stand other peers of France, their thoughts hidden beneath masks of grief and concern. They whisper, discussing the main unspoken question. What will happen next? For there is another claimant, distant but no less dangerous for that. There, across the Channel in foggy England, rules the young King Edward III. His mother, Isabella of France, nicknamed the She-Wolf of France, is the dying Charles's own sister. And by blood, Edward is even closer to the fading monarch than Philip of Valois. He is his direct nephew, but can a woman transmit a right to the throne that she herself cannot possess? This question, like a poisonous thorn, pierced the very heart of French statehood. The French barons, looking at the domineering and cruel Isabella, who had overthrown her own husband, shuddered at the mere thought that such a woman or her foreign son would sit on the throne of the lilies. No, France would not be ruled through a distaff. Salic law, that is their shield. King Charles lets out a soft groan. His gaze clears for a moment. He looks at his pregnant wife, Jeanne d'Evreux. All hope rests on her. If she gives birth to a son, the dynasty will be saved. If a daughter is born, the door to the future will swing open and a hurricane will burst through it. The dying monarch, gathering his last strength, bequeaths the regency to Philip of Valois until the child's birth. And then his breath ceases. The king is dead. A ringing silence descends upon the castle, broken only by the queen's stifled sobs. But in this silence, the rumble of an approaching storm can already be heard. None of those present in this room yet know that they are on the threshold, not just of a dynastic crisis. They are on the threshold of the longest, bloodiest, and most grueling war in the history of medieval Europe. A war that will last 116 years, see several generations of kings, redraw the map of the continent, destroy the flower of chivalry, give birth to new heroes and terrible villains, elevate a peasant girl to a pedestal, and forever change the self-awareness of two great nations. The name of this coming catastrophe is the 100 Years' War. In 2 months, Queen Jeanne will give birth to a daughter. The knot will be tightened for good, and the threads of fate of England and France will intertwine into a bloody tangle that cannot be unraveled even at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. The narrative of the great confrontation begins. Before the roar of English longbows and the clang of French swords echo across the battlefields, it is necessary to descend into the cellars of history, where in the semi-darkness of centuries the seeds of the coming war were ripening. For the conflict in the year 1337 was not a sudden storm in a clear sky. It was the inevitable result of nearly 300 years of tangled relationships, broken oaths, and territorial disputes that began long before the last Capuchin breathed his last. Our story must return to the mid-12th century, to a time when the very idea of England and France as unified, monolithic nations was still vague and undefined. At the center of this early drama stands one of the most extraordinary women of the Middle Ages, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The heiress to the vast and rich Duchy of Aquitaine, which occupied almost all of southwestern France, she was first the Queen of France, wife of Louis VII. But their marriage, lacking a male heir and marred by mutual misunderstanding, was annulled. Aquitaine was not just a collection of lands, it was a whole world, separate from northern France. Here they spoke a different language, Languedoc, the language of troubadours and courtly love. The culture was more refined, the morals freer. And most importantly, this land was fabulously rich. The endless vineyards around Bordeaux produced the famous claret wine, which flowed in rivers to England and other countries of northern Europe, bringing colossal income to the duchy, salt mines, fertile lands, bustling ports. All this made Aquitaine the most coveted prize in all of France. Its inhabitants felt themselves more Aquitanian than French, and a change of suzerain for them was a matter not so much of patriotism as of economic advantage and the preservation of their ancient liberties. And then Eleanor took a step that changed history. She married the young, energetic, and ambitious Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy. When in 1154 Henry ascended the English throne as Henry II, a monstrous political entity appeared on the map of Europe, which historians would call the Angevin Empire. Imagine this picture: the King of England, Henry II, owned not only his island but also more than half of France. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, and thanks to his wife, the huge Aquitaine. His domain stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees. The French king, his formal suzerain, looked like a pathetic dwarf beside him, squeezed into his small domain around Paris and Orléans. This created an unimaginable and explosive situation. According to feudal laws, Henry, as King of England, was a sovereign equal to any monarch. But as Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, he was a vassal of the French crown and was obliged to pay homage, an oath of loyalty to the King of France. The most powerful monarch in Europe was forced to kneel before his weaker but formally superior neighbor. It was humiliating. It was unbearable, and it became the main source of tension for the next century and a half. The kings of France from the Capuchin dynasty, starting with Philip II Augustus, set themselves the main goal: to crush this empire and return French lands to the direct control of the crown. This was their historical mission, and they acted methodically, cunningly, and relentlessly. Philip Augustus, a brilliant intriguer and politician, skillfully used the quarrels between Henry II and his own sons, Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. He set them against each other and against their father, weakening the Plantagenets from within. After Richard's death, his younger brother John, a far less successful and authoritative ruler, ascended the throne, and Philip delivered the decisive blow. Accusing John of violating his vassal obligations, he, as suzerain, declared his French possessions confiscated. In 1204, Rouen, the capital of Normandy, fell. The ancient duchy, homeland of William the Conqueror, returned to the rule of the French crown. In the following years, Anjou, Maine, and part of Poitou were reconquered. The Angevin Empire collapsed. Of the once gigantic Plantagenet domains on the continent, only a fragment remained. The Duchy of Aquitaine, which in France was more often called Guyenne, with its rich capital Bordeaux. And this fragment became a festering wound, a constant source of conflict. The English kings never reconciled themselves to the loss of their hereditary lands. They considered themselves robbed. The French kings in turn saw the preservation of English sovereignty over Guyenne as a threat to the unity of their kingdom and a constant pretext for English interference. Each new generation of English monarchs was forced to make a humiliating trip to France to pay homage for Guyenne. Each time, this procedure was accompanied by disputes over its form. Should the English king kneel on both knees or one? Should he remove his crown and sword? These seemingly petty protocol details were, in fact, matters of prestige and sovereignty. By the beginning of the 14th century, two more powerful factors were added to this main dynastic territorial dispute. The first was economic. In northern Europe, the county of Flanders was flourishing. Its cities, Ghent, Bruges, Ypres, were the largest centers of textile production in the world. But their entire economy depended on one resource: English wool. England was the main supplier of high-quality raw material, and Flanders was its main processor. This created a very close economic bond. However, politically, Flanders was a vassal of the French king who sought to establish full control over the rich and wayward cities. The Flemish burghers in turn fought desperately for their freedoms and constantly sought support from the English crown. The English kings understood that control over wool supplies was a most powerful lever of pressure on both Flanders and France. An end to wool exports could cause an economic collapse in Flanders, and riots directed against the pro-French count. Thus, Flanders became another battlefield for English and French interests. The second factor was Scotland, England's eternal northern enemy. Seeking to secure itself from its powerful southern neighbor Scotland, in 1295, concluded an alliance with France which went down in history as the Auld Alliance. This treaty stated that if one of the countries was attacked by England, the other had to attack England from its side. For France, this was an ideal tool. Every time England began to show excessive activity on the continent, France could activate the Scottish threat, forcing the English to fight on two fronts. For the English kings, this meant that any serious campaign in France was risky as long as the Scottish problem was not solved. And so, by the year 1328, at the time of Charles IV's death, the political map was ready to explode. The Guyenne question, the humiliating homage, economic rivalry in Flanders, the Scottish alliance, and, most importantly, the bitter memory of lost lands. All this created a volatile mixture. The dynastic crisis was merely the spark that fell into a powder keg that had been accumulating for centuries. When the French peers, rejecting Edward III's claims, placed Philip of Valois on the throne as Philip VI, they thought they were solving a problem. In fact, they were pulling the trigger of history. And while the new Valois dynasty was establishing itself in France, across the Channel in Windsor Castle, a young lion destined to plunge both kingdoms into the abyss of war was maturing and gaining strength. His name was Edward III. But his path to sole rule was dramatic and bloody. He ascended the throne as a boy in 1327. After his mother Isabella of France and her powerful lover Roger Mortimer overthrew and apparently cruelly murdered his father, King Edward II. For the first years of his reign, the country was effectively ruled by Isabella and Mortimer, who plunged England into a mire of corruption and humiliation. But young Edward was no pawn. The blood of the Plantagenets flowed in his veins, the blood of warriors and conquerors. In 1330, at the age of 18, he carried out a daring palace coup. At night, through a secret passage, he and his loyal supporters entered Nottingham Castle, arrested Mortimer in his own mother's chambers, and soon had him executed. He sent Isabella into honorable exile, taking full power into his own hands. England had a real king, ambitious, energetic, full of chivalric ideals, and eager to wash away the shame of his father's reign and the humiliation England had endured. Initially, Edward was in no hurry to press his claims to the French throne. He even paid homage to Philip VI for Guyenne in 1329, though he did so with clear reluctance. For the first few years, he was busy restoring order in England and fighting Scotland. But Philip VI, wanting to assert his authority, behaved increasingly provocatively. He granted asylum to the Scottish King David Bruce, openly supporting England's enemies. He interfered in the affairs of Guyenne, constantly accepting appeals from Edward's Gascon vassals, thereby undermining his authority in the duchy. For Edward, this was a direct violation of his rights as Duke. The cup of patience overflowed in 1337. In response to France's continued support for the Scots, Edward decided to strike at the most painful point of the French economy: Flanders. He imposed an embargo on wool exports. As expected, the Flemish cities, finding themselves on the brink of collapse, rebelled against their pro-French count. Their leader, the charismatic Ghent brewer Jacob van Artevelde, concluded an alliance with Edward. Philip VI regarded this as an act of war. On May 24, 1337, he announced the confiscation of the Duchy of Guyenne. This was the final step. In response, Edward III decided on the unthinkable. He officially proclaimed himself King of France based on the rights of his mother. He combined the English leopards and the French lilies on his coat of arms. This was not just a territorial dispute. It was a challenge to the legitimacy of the Valois dynasty itself. War had become inevitable. The first years of the war were sluggish, without major battles. It consisted of minor skirmishes on the borders of Guyenne and in Flanders. But in 1340, Edward decided on a major operation. He assembled a huge fleet to transport his army to the continent and join his Flemish allies. Philip VI, aware of this, ordered his fleet to block the English path. The French fleet, reinforced by Genoese and Castilian mercenary ships, was a formidable force, about 200 vessels. It anchored in the Bay of Sluys, off the coast of Flanders. The French admirals, confident of victory, made a fatal mistake. They arranged their ships in 3 dense lines, chaining them together. In effect, they turned their fleet into 3 immobile wooden fortresses, depriving themselves of maneuverability. On June 24, 1340, the English fleet, numbering about 150 ships, approached the bay. Edward III personally commanded the fleet from his flagship, the cog Thomas. Seeing the French formation, he immediately understood their mistake. Using the advantage of wind and tide, Edward ordered an attack. The English ships, with banners bearing the new coat of arms flying from their masts, stormed into the bay. The Battle of Sluys was, in essence, a land battle on water. The ships closed in, and a brutal boarding fight began. But the English had a decisive advantage: their famous longbows. From the decks of the English cogs, a deadly shower of arrows rained down on the crowded French ships. Each arrow, fired by an experienced archer, could pierce light armor or find a gap in plate mail. The French crossbowmen, whose weapons reloaded much more slowly, could do nothing against this hurricane. The arrows cleared the decks and English men-at-arms went to board. The fight was incredibly fierce. Edward himself was wounded by an arrow in the thigh but continued to command the battle. By evening, the French fleet was almost completely destroyed. French losses were catastrophic. Up to 20,000 men killed, drowned, or captured. Almost all their ships were captured or sunk. The victory at Sluys was stunning. It not only opened the way to the continent for Edward, but also gave England complete naval supremacy for decades to come. The English Channel became an English lake, allowing Edward to freely transport troops and supplies for future campaigns. Legend has it that after the battle, Philip II's court jesters, afraid to deliver the bad news, told him, "Your Majesty, the English sailors are great cowards. They did not dare to jump into the water like our brave Frenchmen." Despite the victory at sea, Edward's subsequent campaigns in Flanders and Brittany, where a war of succession had broken out, did not bring decisive success. The French avoided major battles, wearing down the English with scorched earth tactics. But in 1346, Edward changed his strategy. He landed not in Flanders or Guyenne, but in Normandy, in the very heart of Plantagenet domains. He began a so-called chevauchée, a deep, devastating raid into enemy territory. The goal of a chevauchée was not so much battle as the economic weakening of the enemy, a demonstration of his inability to protect his subjects and the undermining of his authority. The English army, numbering about 15,000 men, passed through Normandy with fire and sword, plundering towns and villages, and moved towards Paris. Philip VI, insulted to the core by this audacity, assembled a huge army, by some estimates twice or even 3 times the size of the English one. He began to pursue Edward, seeking to force a general battle and destroy him. Edward, realizing the danger, began to retreat north towards the coast to have the option of evacuating his army. Near the village of Crécy and Poitiers, the exhausted English were forced to give battle. Their fate seemed sealed. But Edward was not only a warrior, but also a brilliant tactician. He chose an ideal defensive position, a gentle slope of a hill. He ordered his knights and men-at-arms to dismount and placed them in the center. And on the flanks, protected by dug wolf pits and sharpened stakes, he placed his main force, the English and Welsh archers, armed with the great yew longbow. This weapon, simple in appearance, became a medieval machine gun in the hands of an experienced archer. Archers could release up to 10 or 12 arrows per minute over a distance of more than 200 meters. Their arrows had enormous penetrating power. On August 26, 1346, the French army approached the English positions. The day was drawing to a close, but the French knights, boiling with impatience and a thirst for revenge, were eager for battle. Philip perhaps wanted to postpone the attack until morning, but could not restrain the aristocratic free-for-all. The hired Genoese crossbowmen went into the attack first, but they were exhausted from a long march. Their bowstrings were damp from the recent rain, and they found themselves under fire from the archers, whose bowstrings were dry. Unable to withstand the deadly hail of arrows, the Genoese wavered and fled. And then the main force of France entered the fray, its heavy knightly cavalry. What happened next became a nightmare for French chivalry. Attack after attack, 15 or 16 times, waves of French knights in shining armor on mighty war horses with lances couched rushed up the slope. And each time they were met by the deafening hum of thousands of bowstrings and a cloud of arrows that, according to eyewitnesses, darkened the sun. The arrows struck the horses, which, maddened by pain, threw their riders and caused confusion in the rear ranks. The arrows found vulnerable spots in the armor, pierced visors and joints of plate. The hillside turned into a mess of mud, blood, and dying men and horses. The attacks broke one after another against the steadfastness of the English men-at-arms and the deadly fire of the archers. In one of the attacks, even the blind King John of Bohemia fell. Having ordered his knights to lead him into the thick of the fight so he could strike at least one blow with his sword, he died, and his motto, "I serve," was taken up by Edward's young son, Edward the Black Prince, who showed miracles of bravery that day. By nightfall, the battle was over. The French army was not just defeated, it was annihilated. Thousands of corpses lay on the battlefield, among them the flower of the French aristocracy. 2 dukes, 11 princes, over 1,500 knights and barons. English losses were incomparably small, perhaps only a few hundred men. The Battle of Crécy was not just a military victory, it was a triumph of English tactics, discipline, and a new type of weapon over outdated knightly cavalry. It showed that well-organized infantry supported by archers could crush any, even the most numerous and valiant army of heavy horsemen. After Crécy, Edward moved to the strategically important port of Calais and besieged it. The city held out for almost a year. In desperation, the citizens sent envoys to Edward begging for mercy. The king, enraged by the long resistance, demanded that 6 of the most prominent citizens come out to him barefoot, with ropes around their necks, and surrender the keys to the city and their lives. This cruel ultimatum was met. The 6 burghers of Calais appeared before Edward, ready for death. But his pregnant wife, Queen Philippa of Hainaut, with tears in her eyes, begged her husband to spare them. Edward yielded to his wife's pleas. This legendary episode showed both the cruelty and the chivalric mercy of that era. Calais was taken, its French population expelled, and the city was settled by the English. It became England's most important bridgehead on the continent for the next 200 years. It seemed that England was at the peak of its power. France was demoralized, its army crushed, its treasury empty. But in 1347, a disaster worse than any war befell Europe. From Asia, along trade routes, came the Black Death, the bubonic plague. This pandemic, one of the most devastating in human history, swept across the continent, sparing neither rich nor poor. It arrived on Genoese ships from the Crimea, where the horde, besieging the Genoese fortress of Caffa, had catapulted corpses of plague victims into the city. First, buboes appeared, painful black swellings in the groin and armpits. Then came fever, delirium, and coughing up blood. Death followed in 2 or 3 days in terrible agony. The world was plunged into primal terror. Doctors were powerless. Priests were afraid to approach the dying for the last rites. Relatives abandoned their sick, parents their children, husbands their wives. The streets of cities were piled with corpses that no one could bury. Mass graves filled with horrifying speed. Processions of flagellants appeared. Self-floggers who went from city to city, whipping themselves and crying out for God's mercy. Everything was blamed on the sins of mankind, an unfavorable alignment of the planets, or most often the Jews, who were accused of poisoning wells. A wave of the most brutal Jewish pogroms swept across Europe. Social foundations collapsed. In a few years, the epidemic claimed, according to various estimates, from 1/3 to half of Europe's entire population. The world was changed forever. The war subsided for a time. Both countries were too exhausted by the epidemic to conduct active military operations. But the plague also had long-term consequences. The sharp decline in population led to a shortage of labor. Peasants and artisans who survived the epidemic began to demand higher pay for their labor. This led to social upheavals, peasant revolts such as the Jacquerie in France and the Peasants' Revolt in England. The feudal system, based on the labor of serfs tied to the land, received a most severe blow. Thus the Black Death, while bringing untold suffering, paradoxically accelerated the disintegration of the old world and the birth of the new. The war resumed in the mid-13th century. In France, Philip VI, who died of the plague, was succeeded by his son John II, nicknamed the Good, in the sense of brave or valiant. He was the embodiment of chivalric ideals, but alas possessed neither the talents of a commander nor the wisdom of a statesman. The main strike force of the English at this time was Edward's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, who had already distinguished himself at Crécy. He was an outstanding military commander, cruel but effective. In 1356, the Black Prince undertook another devastating chevauchée, this time from Guyenne northwards, into the heart of France. John the Good, like his father 10 years earlier, assembled a huge army and gave chase. He managed to cut off the Black Prince's retreat route near the city of Poitiers. The English army was small, about 6,000 or 7,000 men, and exhausted from the raid. The French had at least 15,000. The situation for the English looked even more hopeless than at Crécy. The Black Prince took up a strong defensive position on a hill, protected on the flanks by vineyards and hedges. He, like his father, dismounted most of his knights. The French, remembering the bitter lesson of Crécy, decided to adopt the enemy's tactics. John the Good ordered most of his knightly cavalry to dismount and attack the English on foot. This was a reasonable but not fully thought-out decision. Knights in heavy armor on foot over rough terrain under a hail of arrows. It was a most severe trial. On September 19, 1356, the battle began. The first attack by French mounted knights intended to break through to the archers was repulsed with huge losses. Then 3 huge battles of dismounted French men-at-arms went on the attack. They advanced slowly but steadily up the slope, suffering heavy losses from arrows, but their numerical superiority was overwhelming. The English ranks began to waver. It seemed that in a little while they would be swept away. And at this critical moment, the Black Prince made a brilliant and risky decision. He ordered a small detachment of mounted knights under the command of the Gascon captain Jean de Grailly, the Captal de Bouc, to make a flanking maneuver and strike the rear and flank of the French army. Simultaneously, the prince himself, gathering the last reserves, including his mounted knights, led a desperate counterattack from the hill. The effect was stunning. The French, confident of victory, were suddenly attacked from 2 sides. Panic began in their ranks. The attack, which was about to be crowned with success, faltered and turned into a disorderly flight. Many noble lords whose horses had been left in the rear could not escape. In the center of this chaos, only one group remained, fighting with desperate courage. It was King John the Good himself with his youngest son Philip, the future Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. The king, wielding a battle axe, fought off the pressing English. Young Philip stood by his father, shouting, "Father, watch your right! Father, watch your left!" But they were surrounded. In the end, wounded and exhausted, the King of France surrendered. The victory at Poitiers was even more resounding than at Crécy. The English had not just routed an enemy army, they had captured the enemy monarch. This was an unheard-of triumph, and an unimaginable humiliation for France. Along with the king, hundreds of the noblest aristocrats were taken prisoner. France was left without a king, without an army, without a government. The country plunged into anarchy. Power passed to the Dauphin, the heir to the throne, Charles, the future Charles V. But his authority was negligible. A rebellion broke out in Paris under the leadership of the provost of the merchants, Etienne Marcel. In the countryside, the Jacquerie erupted, a brutal and bloody peasant revolt against the nobility. The kingdom was falling apart. Edward III was at the height of his power. He held the King of France in his hands and could dictate any terms. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny was signed, ending the first phase of the war. Under its terms, Edward received full sovereign possession, without the need to pay homage, of vast territories. all of Aquitaine and its historical borders, Calais, Poitiers, and other lands. This was almost a third of France. In return, he renounced his claims to the French crown. A gigantic ransom of 3 million gold écus was set for King John. It seemed the war was over with a complete and unconditional victory for England. Edward III had achieved everything he wanted, but history was preparing a new, unexpected turn. The Peace of Bretigny turned out to be only a long respite before a new storm. And while England celebrated its triumph and its King Edward III rested on his laurels in a devastated and humiliated France, the one who was destined to turn the chessboard and begin to win back what was lost was growing up. This was the Dauphin Charles, who in 1364 became King Charles V. Unlike his father, John the Good, and his grandfather, Philip VI, Charles was not a knight warrior. He was sickly, physically weak, never wore armor, and did not participate in battles. His enemies mockingly called him the Scholar King, but behind this unremarkable appearance lay a sharp, calculating, and incredibly perceptive mind. He was a master of diplomacy, a genius of administration, and a subtle psychologist. He understood what his predecessors did not. The war with England could not be won in one decisive battle. It could only be won through patience, cunning, and exhausting the enemy. His nickname, the Wise, was not given to him in vain. Ascending the throne, Charles V began the painstaking work of restoring the kingdom. He carried out a financial reform, streamlining tax collection and creating a stable source of income for the treasury. He reorganized the army, relying not on the feudal levy but on professional paid detachments under the command of captains loyal to him. He understood that France needed not so much a warrior king as an effective manager and strategist, but to implement his strategy he needed a sword, a man capable of realizing his plans on the battlefield. And he found such a man. This sword was a Breton knight from the minor nobility named Bertrand du Guesclin. He was the complete opposite of the king. Ugly, stocky, rude, uneducated, but possessing incredible strength, courage, and a natural talent for command. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, ambushes, surprise attacks, and grueling sieges. He despised chivalric duels and open battles, considering them foolish bravado. His element was a war of attrition. Charles the Wise and Bertrand du Guesclin formed a perfect tandem, the brain and the brawn, the strategist and the tactician. Charles V bided his time. He waited for the English to give him a pretext to break the peace treaty. And such a pretext presented itself. The Black Prince, who had become ruler of Aquitaine, proved to be a poor administrator. To cover the expenses of his luxurious court and military adventures in Spain, he introduced a new heavy hearth tax in the duchy. The Gascon lords, who already disliked the harsh English rule, grumbled, and remembering an old tradition, they appealed against their duke's actions to the King of France. According to the Treaty of Bretigny, Charles had no right to accept such appeals, but he saw his chance. In 1369, to the astonishment and fury of the English, Charles V accepted the Gascons' complaint and summoned the Black Prince to trial in Paris as his vassal. This was a direct challenge and a de facto declaration of war. The war resumed, but this time it followed a completely different scenario. Charles V gave du Guesclin and his other captains a strict order. Under no circumstances were they to engage in a general battle with the English. Instead, they were to follow the English armies, which, as usual, went on devastating raids, chevauchées, and harassed them with minor attacks, ambushing foragers and cutting off stragglers. The main goal was the reconquest of towns and castles. One of Charles's and du Guesclin's brilliant moves was solving the problem of the great companies, bands of mercenaries left unemployed in peacetime who were plundering France itself. Instead of fighting them, Du Guesclin gathered these detachments under his command and led them to Spain to intervene in the war for the Castilian throne on the side of Henry of Trastamara. Thus, in one stroke, he cleared France of robbers and acquired a valuable ally against England and Castile and its powerful fleet. This operation vividly demonstrated a new approach to warfare: flexible, pragmatic, and using not only military force but also diplomacy. The French army, like a shadow, pursued the English but never gave battle. For the English commanders, this was an incredibly frustrating tactic. They craved glory like that of Crécy and Poitiers. They challenged the French to battle, but the French only mocked them from the walls of their castles. The English chevauchés, which had previously undermined the authority of the French crown, now worked against the English themselves. They passed through a devastated country, losing men to hunger, disease, and constant guerrilla attacks, and achieved nothing but fatigue and an empty treasury. And meanwhile, Du Guesclin, who had received from the king the title of Constable of France, the supreme commander, methodically one by one reconquered castles and towns. He acted with cunning, bribery, and surprise night assaults. If a town was too strong, it was put under a tight siege, and they waited until the defenders ran out of food. Gradually, inch by inch, the French crown regained lost territories. Poitou, Saintonge, Angoumois, all these lands, ceded by the Treaty of Bretigny, returned to the rule of Charles de Fourmont. The situation for England was also complicated by personal factors. The great heroes of the past were leaving the stage. The Black Prince, having contracted a serious illness in Spain, became a feeble invalid and died in 1376, never becoming king. His father, Edward III, in his last years fell into senile dementia and was under the influence of his greedy mistress, Alice Perrers. The great conqueror-king died in 1377, abandoned by all, leaving the throne to his young grandson, Richard II. Power in England passed to a regency council, torn by the struggles of aristocratic cliques. In 1380, Bertrand du Guesclin, the faithful sword of Charles the Wise, also died, and soon after the king himself followed. By the time of Charles V's death in 1380, of the vast English domains on the continent, only a few coastal enclaves remained. Calais in the north and a narrow strip around Bordeaux and Bayonne in the south. Virtually all of Edward III's conquests had been nullified. The strategy of Charles the Wise had borne brilliant fruit. France was on the path to completely expelling the English. However, history once again took a sharp turn. After the death of Charles the Wise, young kings ascended both the English and French thrones, Richard II and Charles VI. In both countries, a period of internal instability began, a struggle for power among the young monarch's uncles. The war subsided for a time, replaced by a series of fragile truces. To this was added another factor that split all of Europe. In 1378, the Great Western Schism occurred in the Catholic Church. After the death of Pope Gregory XI, who had returned the See of St. Peter from Avignon to Rome, the cardinals, under pressure from the Roman crowd, elected an Italian, Urban VI, as pope. However, the French cardinals, dissatisfied with his harsh course, soon declared these elections invalid and elected their own pope, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. As a result, the Christian world had two popes, who anathematized each other. Europe was divided. France and its allies, Scotland, Castile, Naples, supported the Avignon pope. England and its allies, the Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, Flanders, remained loyal to Rome. This religious schism further deepened the political confrontation and for many years made a lasting peace impossible. By the end of the 14th century, it seemed the war was losing steam. Both sides were exhausted, but new reasons for conflict were brewing beneath the surface. In England, Richard II was overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became King Henry IV, founder of the House of Lancaster. In France, the young King Charles VI, having grown up and taken power into his own hands, suddenly went mad. During a campaign, he had a fit of insanity, during which he killed several of his knights. From then on, the fits recurred more frequently, and the king sank into a morass of madness, sometimes imagining himself made of glass, sometimes not recognizing his wife and children. France was once again without a strong ruler, and a merciless struggle for power at court began between two factions. The Armagnacs, supporters of the king's brother, Louis of Orléans, and the Burgundians, supporters of the powerful Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless. This struggle soon escalated into a full-scale civil war, drenching France in blood. It was at this moment of chaos, madness, and civil war that a new English king would enter the historical stage, young, ambitious, pious, and ruthless. He would see in France's division a gift from heaven, and an opportunity not just to reclaim lost lands, but to achieve what Edward III had dreamed of: to unite the crowns of England and France. His name was Henry V, and with his appearance the war would enter its most dramatic and bloody phase. While France was plunging into the abyss of its king's madness and the bloody feud between Armagnacs and Burgundians in England in the year 1413, a man ascended the throne who seemed the complete opposite of Charles the Mad: Henry V. In his youth as Prince of Wales, he had led a dissolute life, which is reflected in Shakespeare's plays, where he is portrayed as Prince Hal, friend of the drunkard and merrymaker Falstaff. But upon wearing the crown he was transformed. This was a man of iron will, deeply religious, who considered himself a scourge of God, and at the same time a cold and calculating politician and a brilliant military commander. He saw in France's civil war not a tragedy, but an opportunity provided to him by Providence itself. He decided that the time had come to resolve the French question once and for all. Henry renewed Edward III's claims to the French crown. He demanded not only the return of all lands ceded by the Treaty of Bretigny, but also Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and the hand of the French Princess Catherine of Valois with a huge dowry. The French, even in a state of chaos, could not accept such humiliating terms. Legend has it that in response to his demands, the Dauphin mockingly sent Henry a cask of tennis balls, suggesting that the young king would be better off playing than warring. Henry swore that he would soon play with such balls against the walls of French cities that all of France would tremble. War was inevitable. In August 1415, Henry V landed with an army of about 12,000 men at the mouth of the Seine and besieged the important port of Harfleur. The siege dragged on and cost the English heavy losses, mainly from dysentery. After taking the city, Henry found himself in a difficult position. His army had shrunk to 6,000 to 9,000 men, exhausted by disease. The campaigning season was coming to an end. The most sensible thing would have been to board ships and return to England. But Henry, wanting to demonstrate his right to French soil and to challenge the enemy, made a risky decision. He decided to march from Harfleur to the English enclave of Calais, essentially repeating the route of his great-grandfather Edward III before the Battle of Crécy. The French, temporarily forgetting their quarrels, assembled a huge army. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, and Marshal Boucicaut blocked Henry's path near the small village of Agincourt. The French army, by various estimates, numbered from 20,000 to 30,000 men, while Henry had no more than 6,000, of whom about 5,000 were archers. The English were hungry, sick, and demoralized. The French were confident of victory. On the morning of October 25th, 1415 St. Crispin's Day, the two armies prepared for battle. The battlefield was a narrow, recently plowed field soaked by heavy rains squeezed between two woods. This tightness deprived the French of the ability to use their overwhelming numerical superiority. Henry, like his predecessors, dismounted his knights and placed them in the center, and on the flanks and between the detachments of men-at-arms, he positioned his archers, ordering them to plant sharpened stakes in front of them for protection against cavalry. The French command, remembering the lessons of Crécy and Poitiers, again decided to attack on foot. But they overlooked one thing: the terrible mud. Knights in full plate armor, weighing up to 30 or 40 kilograms, sank into the soaked earth up to their ankles or even knees. Their advance was painfully slow. The battle began. The English archers, advancing to maximum firing range, unleashed their deadly shower of arrows on the slowly trudging French mass. The effect was even more terrible than at Crécy. Heavy bodkin arrows pierced armor. The horses of the few cavalry wounded by arrows panicked, turned, and crashed into their own infantry, creating an unimaginable crush. The first line of the French, having reached the English positions, was already exhausted and had suffered huge losses. They crashed into the wall of English men-at-arms, and a brutal hand-to-hand fight ensued. But due to the cramped conditions and mud, the French could not effectively use their weapons. They were so tightly pressed that they could not even raise their arms to strike. The English, more lightly armed, had the advantage, and the archers, having used up their arrows, dropped their bows, grabbed axes, hammers, and swords, and attacked the helpless, mud-bogged French knights from the flanks. A slaughter began. The English finished off the French knights, struggling in the mud, weighed down by their armor like cattle in a slaughterhouse. In the heat of the battle, Henry received news that a French detachment had attacked his baggage train, fearing it might be an attack on his rear and that the prisoners might be freed and take up arms again. He gave a cruel order to kill all the prisoners. This act, condemned even by the standards of the time, was dictated by desperate necessity. By noon, the battle was over. The field was strewn with the bodies of French aristocrats. French losses were monstrous. From 7 to 10,000 killed, including the constable, 3 dukes, 9 counts, and hundreds of other noble lords. Another 1,500 were taken prisoner. English losses were incredibly small, from 100 to 500 men according to different sources. The victory at Agincourt was a miracle, a triumph of will, tactics, and discipline over brute force and overconfidence. For Henry V, it was an undeniable sign of God's favor. He returned to England an absolute, undisputed national hero. When his ship docked at Dover, the Londoners, without waiting for him to disembark, rushed into the icy November water to carry their victorious king ashore on their shoulders. His triumphal entry into London was a sight never before seen. The streets were decorated with tapestries, wine flowed from the windows, and the citizens, dressed in the king's colors, sang hymns of praise. Theatrical stages were erected along the entire route, on which scenes from the lives of warrior saints and of Henry himself were enacted. This triumph was not just a celebration of a military victory, it was an affirmation of the legitimacy of the Lancastrian dynasty. Henry, the son of a usurper, was now God's anointed, whose right to the throne had been proven on the bloody field of Agincourt. All of England was seized with jubilation and a thirst for new conquests, and France was beheaded and thrown into shock. The Civil War erupted with new force. After Agincourt, Henry V began the methodical conquest of Normandy. City after city, castle after castle surrendered to him. In 1419, he took Rouen, the capital of the duchy. In the same year, an event occurred that definitively pushed France into the arms of the English. On the bridge at Montereau, the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII, met for negotiations with the leader of the Burgundians, John the Fearless. During the meeting, the Dauphin's men treacherously murdered the Duke before his eyes. This murder made an alliance between the Armagnacs and Burgundians impossible. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, thirsting for revenge, concluded a full-fledged alliance with Henry V. Now, with the most powerful French feudal lord as his ally, Henry could dictate any terms. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed, which was supposed to end the war. Under its terms, Henry V married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles the Mad, and was declared regent and heir to the French throne. The son of Charles the Mad, the Dauphin Charles, was declared illegitimate and stripped of all rights to the throne. Thus, after the death of the Mad King, a unified Anglo-French monarchy was to be established under Henry V and his descendants. Henry was at the pinnacle of success. He triumphantly entered Paris with his father-in-law. It seemed the age-old dream of English kings had come true, but fate decreed otherwise. In 1422, during another military campaign, Henry V, invincible in battle, fell ill with dysentery and died suddenly at the age of 35. A few months later, the unfortunate Charles the Mad also died. According to the Treaty of Troyes, the one-year-old son of Henry and Catherine, Henry VI, was proclaimed King of England and France. Henry V's brother, the talented commander and administrator John, Duke of Bedford, became regent in France. The Dauphin Charles, who had taken refuge south of the Loire River in the city of Bourges, did not recognize the treaty. His supporters proclaimed him King Charles VII. But his situation was desperate. He was mockingly called the King of Bourges. He had no army, no money, no authority. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled all of northern France, including Paris. It seemed that the fall of Charles's last strongholds was only a matter of time. In 1428, the English besieged Orléans, the key to the lands south of the Loire. Its fall would mean the final collapse of the King of Bourges. France stood on the brink of an abyss. There was no hope. And at this darkest hour, when the great lords and commanders had despaired, salvation came from where no one expected it. It came from a small village in Lorraine. It had the appearance of a young, illiterate peasant girl who heard the voices of saints. Her name was Joan of Arc. While English and Burgundian troops were slowly but surely tightening the noose around Orléans, and the court of Charles VII in Chinon was in a state of gloom and confusion, events were unfolding in the remote Lorraine village of Domremy that were destined to change not only the course of the war, but the very soul of France. Here, in the family of a well-to-do peasant, a girl named Joan was growing up. She was an ordinary shepherdess, unable to read or write, but distinguished by her deep piety. And so, from about the age of 13, she began to hear voices and see a bright light. She claimed that Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret were speaking to her. At first, they gave her simple instructions to be a good girl and go to church more often. But over time, the voices began to speak of something else. They told her that she, Joan, was chosen by God to save France. Her mission, to lift the siege of Orléans, to crown the Dauphin in Reims, and to drive the English out of the kingdom. To any rational person of that time, this sounded like the ravings of a mad woman. A peasant girl leading armies? Unheard of. But Joan was filled with unshakable faith. In early 1429, at the age of 17, she went to the commander of the nearby fortress of Vaucouleurs, Robert de Baudricourt, and demanded an escort to the Dauphin. At first, she was simply laughed at. But her persistence, her sincerity, and her accurate prediction of a French defeat in the Battle of the Herrings near Orléans, which she learned from her voices before the official news arrived, made the stern warrior reconsider. In the end, he relented. With her hair cut, dressed in men's clothing, Joan, accompanied by a small escort, set out on a perilous journey through enemy territory to the castle of Chinon, where Charles was. Joan's arrival in Chinon caused a stir. The court was full of skeptics and schemers. To test her, Charles, according to legend, devised a trial. He mingled with the crowd of courtiers, placing another man on the throne. But Joan, who had never seen him before, unerringly walked straight to him and knelt. She announced her mission to him. Charles, indecisive and doubtful, subjected her to a long examination. She was interrogated by theologians in Poitiers, who were to determine if her voices were not from the devil. She was tested for virginity, as it was believed that the devil could not make a pact with a virgin. In the end, the commission concluded. There was nothing evil in her, and given the desperate situation of the kingdom, she should be given a chance. Charles, having nothing left to lose, agreed. Joan was given armor, a white banner with the image of Jesus and the saints, and a small detachment. With this detachment, she marched to the besieged Orléans. Her arrival in the city at the end of April, 1429, was like a lightning strike. She breathed new faith into the exhausted defenders and tired commanders. Her presence on the walls, her fearlessness, her confidence in victory worked wonders. She was not a commander in the modern sense of the word. She did not develop tactical plans. She was a spiritual leader, a living symbol of divine intervention. The soldiers, previously downcast and prone to drunkenness, were transformed. They believed that God was with them. Against the advice of cautious commanders, Joan insisted on an immediate attack on the English fortifications, or bastions, surrounding the city. One by one, the French troops, under her inspiring leadership, stormed the English forts. During the assault on the main fortress of Les Tourelles, Joan was wounded by a crossbow bolt that pierced her shoulder. The English rejoiced, thinking the witch was killed. But Joan, pulling out the arrow, returned to the fight, inspiring her warriors. In the end, Les Tourelles was taken. On May 8, 1429, the English, demoralized and having suffered heavy losses, lifted the siege of Orléans and retreated. What had seemed impossible had been accomplished. The Maid had saved Orléans. Lifting the siege of Orléans became a turning point in the war. It was not so much a military as a psychological victory. It destroyed the myth of English invincibility. Now Joan insisted on fulfilling the second part of her mission, the march to Reims. This city had immense sacred significance. It was there, in Reims Cathedral, that all French kings were traditionally crowned, receiving anointment with holy oil. Coronation in Reims made a monarch the legitimate ruler in the eyes of God and men. But the path there lay through enemy-controlled territory. Charles and his advisors hesitated, but Joan was adamant. The French army embarked on a daring raid towards Reims. Cities that just yesterday were loyal to the English and Burgundians opened their gates to her without a fight. The fame of the Maid flew ahead of the army. On July 17, 1429, in Reims Cathedral, in the presence of Joan with her banner, the Dauphin Charles was solemnly crowned and became Charles VII, the legitimate king of France. Joan's mission was practically fulfilled. After the coronation, however, her luck began to change. An attempt to storm Paris failed. Courtiers, jealous of her fame, began to whisper to the king that she was no longer needed. Charles VII, having achieved legitimacy, again leaned towards his favorite tactic of negotiations and truces. Joan, however, craved battle, the complete expulsion of the English. In May 1430, during a sortie from the besieged city of Compiègne, she was captured by the Burgundians. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, understood the value of his captive. He sold her to his allies, the English, for a huge sum of 10,000 livres. For the English, Joan's trial was a matter of paramount importance. They needed to prove that she was not a messenger of God, but a witch and a heretic. This was the only way to discredit the coronation of Charles VII and regain the moral high ground. Joan's trial took place in Rouen. It was a political show trial, dressed up as an ecclesiastical tribunal. It was presided over by Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, a loyal supporter of the English. For several months, the illiterate peasant girl was interrogated by dozens of the most learned theologians. They tried to trap her with words, to confuse her with captious questions. But Joan answered with astonishing dignity, intelligence, and simplicity. When asked if she was certain she was in God's grace, she gave a brilliant reply. "If I am, may God keep me there. If I am not, may God so place me." Any other answer would have been a trap, but the outcome of the trial was predetermined. She was accused of heresy for wearing men's clothing and for believing her voices more than the opinion of the church militant, that is, the earthly church hierarchy. Under threat of being burned at the stake, Joan, perhaps in a moment of weakness, signed a recantation. Her life was spared, but she was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, soon after, for reasons not entirely clear, perhaps men's clothing was planted on her, or she was tricked into wearing it. She once again donned male attire. This was regarded as a relapse into heresy. Now there was no mercy for her. On May 30th, 1431, in the old market square in Rouen, the 19-year-old Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. Her last word was, "Jesus." Her ashes were scattered over the Seine so that she would have no grave that could become a place of pilgrimage. The English thought they had destroyed her, but they were mistaken. They had created a martyr and an immortal symbol of France. Although Charles VII did nothing to save Joan, her sacrifice was not in vain. It ignited a flame of national resistance that could no longer be extinguished. In 1435, a key event occurred. Charles VII managed to make peace with his main enemy within France, the Duke of Burgundy. By the Treaty of Arras, Philip the Good broke his alliance with England and recognized Charles as the legitimate king. This was a mortal blow to the English position. In 1436, Charles VII triumphantly entered Paris. In the following years, during long truces, Charles, now nicknamed the Victorious, carried out fundamental reforms. He created the first regular standing army in Europe, the Compagnies d'Ordonnance. These were professional, well-armed, and disciplined soldiers on the king's permanent payroll. But his main trump card was a revolution in artillery. Under the leadership of the brothers Jean and Gaspard Bureau, talented engineers and organizers, French artillery transformed from an auxiliary tool into a decisive force on the battlefield. The Bureau brothers standardized calibers and improved the technology of casting bronze cannons, making them lighter and more mobile. They developed new, more effective gun carriages and, most importantly, created a professional corps of artillerymen capable of delivering rapid and accurate fire. Instead of heavy and inaccurate stone cannonballs, cast iron ones, which had much greater penetrating power, were increasingly used. This new deadly artillery could breach the walls of the most impregnable castles, which had previously withstood sieges for many months in a matter of days or even hours. The era of feudal fortresses was coming to an end. By 1449, France was ready for the final blow. Charles resumed the war, but now it was a completely different war. The French army, professional and equipped with powerful artillery, was on the offensive. The English, torn by internal strife under the weak King Henry VI, could not offer serious resistance. In 1450, at the Battle of Poitiers, the French army demonstrated its complete superiority. The English archers, so formidable in the past, were simply swept away by the fire of French cannons and a charge of heavy cavalry. Soon all of Normandy was lost to the English. The final act of the drama was played out in Guyenne, the ancient stronghold of England. In 1453, the old veteran, the nearly 80-year-old John Talbot, one of the last heroes of Agincourt, tried to retake Bordeaux. On July 17th, 1453, at the castle of Castillon, his army clashed with French forces occupying a fortified camp protected by hundreds of cannons. Talbot, true to the traditions of the past, led his men in a desperate attack. They were met with murderous artillery fire. Talbot himself was killed by a cannonball. His army was routed. The Battle of Castillon became the last major battle of the 100 Years' War. Soon, Bordeaux surrendered. 116 years of war had come to an end. England had only one city left on the continent, Calais. Thus ended the longest war in European history. It left deep, indelible scars on the bodies of both countries, but at the same time it became the crucible in which new nations and new realities were forged. For France, the war, which began as a catastrophe, ultimately turned into a triumph. Yes, its lands were ravaged, its population had declined, and its aristocracy had suffered monstrous losses. But from the ashes of war, a strong, centralized monarchy was born. The king, relying on a standing army and a ramified bureaucratic apparatus, became the absolute master in his kingdom. The power of the great feudal lords was undermined. But most importantly, the war gave birth to the French nation. If at the beginning of the conflict an inhabitant of Normandy and an inhabitant of Gascony considered themselves different peoples, the common struggle against a foreign enemy, crowned by the feat of Joan of Arc, created a sense of a single national identity. For England, the results were the direct opposite. The war, which began with brilliant victories, ended in a humiliating defeat and the loss of almost all continental possessions, which the English crown had held for 3 centuries. The dream of a dual monarchy crumbled to dust. The defeat in the war led to a deep political crisis. Thousands of unemployed soldiers and knights returned to the island, knowing no other trade than war. The dissatisfied aristocracy, blaming the weak King Henry VI and his circle for the defeat, began a struggle for the throne. In 1455, just 2 years after the Battle of Castillon, a brutal dynastic war broke out in England, which went down in history as the Wars of the Roses. England was plunged into chaos for 30 years. Having lost its continental empire, England gradually began to see itself as an island, a maritime power. Its future was now tied not to European lands, but to the ocean. The 100 Years' War also changed the face of warfare itself. It began as a conflict of feudal knightly armies and ended with battles where professional infantry and artillery played the decisive role. The era of the knight's dominance on the battlefield was gone forever. The English longbow and then the French cannon became symbols of this new time. Centuries have passed. The fields of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt have long been overgrown with grass. But the echo of this great and terrible war still resounds in history. It has left us images that have become eternal. The courage of the Black Prince, the wisdom of Charles V, the tragic greatness of Henry V, and of course the immortal feat of the peasant girl from Domremy who became the patron saint of France. It was a war of kings and dynasties, but it changed the destinies of millions of ordinary people, making them for the first time aware of themselves not just as subjects of their lord, but as English and French. From the fire and blood of the 100 Years' War, modern Europe was born.